World War I, or the Great War, saw the use of many relatively new technologies. Technologies like armored cars, tanks, and airplanes. It's true that aircrafts were not used for the first time in World War I, but it was during the war where airplanes became heavily used and nations realized their value. There are many famous aircrafts that were used during the war, like the German Fokker D7, the French Spad 13 and Nieuport 17, the British Royal Aircraft Factory SE5, and the most famous one, the Sopwith F1 Camel. The latter was one of the best fighters of World War I, and the best among British fighters. The Sopwith F1, which was nicknamed the Camel because of the hump over the breeches of its twin Vickers machine guns, and until this day, the Camel is still considered as one of the greatest fighter aircrafts in the British aviation history. Let's start from the beginning. In 1903, the Wright brothers marked the beginning of modern aviation when they flew the Wright Flyer airplane for the first time. 6 years after that, on August 2nd, 1909, the US Army Signal Corps purchased a Wright Model A, which became the first military aircraft in history. And in 1911, the Italians used a variety of aircraft types in reconnaissance and bombing roles during the Italo-Turkish War. On October 23, 1911, an Italian pilot, Captain Carlo Piazza, flew over Turkish lines on the world's first aerial reconnaissance mission. And on November 1st, the first ever aerial bomb was dropped by Giulio Gavotti on Turkish troops in Libya, from an earlier model of Etrich Tloba of aircrafts. The Turks, lacking on-site aircraft weapons, were the first to shoot down an airplane by rifle fire. In 1912, the British founded the Royal Flying Corps, or RFC. It consisted of a military and naval wing and a central flying school that provided training for pilots. In the early 2 years of its establishment, the RFC tested several airplanes for their capabilities in artillery spotting, aerial photography, and night flying. And in 1914, the Great War began, and aircrafts were used from day one. During the early parts of the war, the RFC's main mission was artillery spotting and photographic reconnaissance. The Germans, on the other hand, had 10 Zeppelins and 3 smaller airships. However, airships suffered from a huge problem, which was the highly explosive nature of the hydrogen gas that gave their lifting power. This meant that daylight raids was not an option, especially after losing 3 Zeppelins in the first month of the war. The German Navy, however, mounted a night bombing offensive, which is seen as the first strategic bombardment campaign in history. Reconnaissance operations were of high value for both sides. For example, RFC aviators provided reconnaissance intel that enabled the British and French armies to counterattack in the decisive Battle of the Marne on September 6 to 12, 1914, turning back the invading Germans just short of Paris. And as the importance of aerial reconnaissance and artillery spotting grew, the idea of being able to destroy enemy spotter planes grew with it. In the early days of the war, pilots and observers used pistols, rifles, and even shotguns to attack enemy aircrafts, but this had little effect. Machine guns were the obvious solution to this problem. Early attempts to mount a machine gun in a fighter was a 2-seat configuration where the observer would take on the role of a gunner. This configuration, however, proved to be with little effect, so a new configuration had to be implemented. An ideal configuration would be mounting the gun in front of the airplane, where the pilot would fire by aiming the aircraft at the designated target. This configuration would have a much better performance, but firing at an angle to avoid hitting the propeller would produce little success. The solution to this problem emerged in the spring of 1915 in the form of an interrupter gear, or a gun synchronization device, invented by the French engineer Raymond Solinier. This regulated a machine gun's fire so as to enable the bullets to pass between the blades of the spinning propeller without hitting it. So with this new mechanism, machine guns can now be mounted in front of a fighter. The first effective and known use of the synchronization mechanism was performed by Roland Garros, the famous sporting pilot who was at the time a fighter pilot With his Moran L monoplane, Garros shot down 3 German aircrafts on April 1st, 13th and 18th. Then on April 19th, he force landed his aeroplane and was captured by the Germans. Garros attempted to set his airplane on fire so the Germans would not lay their hands on the aircraft, but he couldn't do so. So after that, German technicians and engineers examined the airplane and found out about the interrupter gear. Once they realized about the interrupter gear, the engineer Anthony Fokker was given the task of designing a similar device, and he came up with one, which he fitted onto a monoplane of his own design. This fighter, which was called Fokker Eindecker, gave the German Air Force an upper hand over the Allies from July 1915 all the way to October of that same year, in a period known as Fokker's Scourge. After the success of Fokker's monoplane, warring nations entered a race to build a better fighter. The French released a new version of their Nieuport biplane with the machine gun mounted on top of the wing, allowing it to fire without hitting the propeller. The British, on the other hand, also released 2 new fighters, the DH-2 and the FE-2B Pushers, with the nose-mounted guns. The race to build a better fighter continued, and in mid-1916, the Germans took the lead with their Albatros series, the Albatros D1, D2 and D3. These fighters were faster and better than those of the Allies, and could also carry 2 machine guns without sacrificing performance. British fighters at the time, like the Sopwith Pop and triplane, couldn't match with the Albatros fighters, so a new fighter had to be made. The man who would take on the responsibility of designing this new airplane was Herbert Smith, chief designer at Sopwith. The first prototype of the Camel that was ordered by the Admiralty completed its maiden flight in February 1917 and was followed by 2 more development airframes with different engines. The first Camel were delivered to the Royal Naval Air Service in May 1917, and in July of that same year, Camels were delivered to the Royal Flying Corps, equipping number 70 and number 45 squadrons. Also in that month, the Battle of Ypres occurred, in which the F-1 Camels were involved, and by the end of 1917, approximately 1,325 F-1 Camels entered service. The Sopwith F-1 Camel is a biplane monocoque fighter. The Camel had a length of 5.64 meters, a wingspan of 8.53 meters, and a height of 2.59 meters. It had a max takeoff weight of 667 kilograms and was powered by a 150 horsepower Bentley BR1 9-cylinder piston engine. With this engine, the fighter could reach a maximum speed of 187 kilometers per hour and could stay in the air for 2.5 hours. The fighter also had a max altitude of 20,000 feet, and for the armament, the Camel had 2 7.7mm fixed forward Vikings machine guns, powerful armaments for taking enemy aircraft. The aircraft featured a flat upper wing, while the dihedral on the lower wing was doubled. The result was a characteristic tapered gap between the wings. While the Camel was better than the Pop and triplane that preceded it, it was trickier to fly, and it required a great deal of skill and experience to master it. And even sometime it proved fatal for beginner pilots, but in the hand of an expert pilot it was probably the best dogfighter of World War I. A key factor of the Camel maneuverability was the fact that the engine, pilots and armaments were all concentrated at the front of the fighter. One of the things that pilots experienced while flying the Camel was that during a turn to the left, the nose would rise abruptly, while a turn in the opposite direction would see the nose drop. The pilot had to make extensive use of the rudder to counteract these habits and prevent the fighter from entering an uncontrollable spin. Sometimes pilots discovered that they could forego a simple 1/4 left-hand turn in favor of a 3/4 right turn, which some argued could be executed faster and with a useful disorienting effect on a potential foe. By placing the pilots under the center section of the top wing, the field of view was more restricted than on other biplanes. The upper wings shuts out a lot of sky, hence the need to leave open areas in the center section to give the pilots some upward view. Also, pilots had to always be careful to enter and exit the cockpit without damaging the airframe. June 1917, the Sopwith Camel entered service with No. 4 Squadron of the Royal Naval Air Service, which was stationed near Dunkirk. This was the first squadron to operate the fighter. Its first combat flights and reportedly its first victory claim were both made on 4th July 1917. By the end of July, the Camel also equipped No. 3 and No. 9 naval squadrons, and it had become operational with No. 70 squadrons of the Royal Flying Corps. By February 1918, 13 squadrons had Camels as their primary fighter. The Camel proved in service to have better maneuverability than the Albatros D3 and D5, and offered heavier armaments and better performance than the Pup and triplane. Together with the SE-5A and SPAD S-13, it helped to re-establish the Allied aerial superiority that lasted well into 1918. Also, a sea version of the Camel was made. It was called the WW1, and it was designated to operate from platforms on warships, towed lighters, or from Royal Navy's new aircraft carriers. The Sea Camel was slightly different than the original Camel. It had a slightly shorter wingspan and a Bentley BR1 as its standard engine. Additionally, one Vickers gun was replaced by an overwing Lewis gun. The Sea Camels were deployed on 5 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and 26 cruisers of the Royal Navy. On August 11, 1918, a Sea Camel flown by Lieutenant Stuart Cully intercepted and destroyed the zipline L-53 over. Early in 1918, while the pilots of the RFC and RNAS in France learned how to master the Camel in combat, the fighter went into action over southern England against German night bombers. One of the biggest threats was posed by the Zeppelin R-type. This giant was capable of carrying a 2,200-pound bomb 14,000 feet with a speed of 80 miles per hour under the power of its 4 260 horsepower Mercedes engines. Moreover, it was defended by 5 machine guns, which made it a much tougher target than the Gotha. One of the famous Camels was the number B6313, which was flown by the Canadian Major William George Barker. With his Camel, Major Barker scored most of his victories, which were 46 aircrafts and airships, shot down from September 1917 to September 19th in 404 operational flying hours, making him the most decorated serviceman in the history of Canada. In total, over 4,590 Camels were built, and Camel pilots have been credited with downing 1,294 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter of the conflict. This was the video. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe and like. If you have any suggestions for us, please leave them in the comments, and see you on the next time.